You won't believe what these abandoned amusement parks look like now. Amusement parks have been popular entertainment venues around the world since the first enclosed one opened in Coney Island in 1895. While there are now almost 1,000 parks globally, for every successful park, countless others have fallen into disrepair and ruin. This can happen due to poor planning, an uninspired concept, or safety failures. Often, these venues are simply shut down and left to deteriorate, leaving only a faint memory of what the creators originally intended. Let's take a look at 20 scary abandoned amusement parks. Number 20. Nara, Dreamland, Japan. If the huge castle at the entrance, the artificial mountain, and the main street full of stores and games of Nara Dreamland seem familiar, that's because in 1961 it was intentionally opened as Japan's answer to the Disneyland theme park in California. Built near the city of Nara, it was an immediate success, and at its peak, attracted almost 2 million visitors per year. Things began to take a downturn, however, when the Tokyo Disneyland opened in 1983, and subsequently Tokyo Disney Sea and the Universal Studios Japan within 30 miles of Nara Dreamland, and visitor numbers plummeted to such an extent that in 2006, after being open for 45 years, it was forced to close. Even by that time, there had been so little investment in the maintenance of the site that rides were beginning to rust, and the castle itself had been declared a safety hazard. And for the next 10 years before it was fully demolished, it became more like a nightmare land with nature beginning to reclaim the site. It was covered in foliage growing through the paving stones and the tracks of the rides. The buildings began to crumble, and rust took hold everywhere you could look. Because of its history and the way it had been left, Nara Dreamland became a popular site for urban explorers, but because of the increasing risk someone might seriously injure themselves as they walked through the decrepit structures, there was no choice but to remove what was left entirely. Number 19. Consonno. Until 1962, Consonno was a small medieval town in northern Italy with a population of about 300, and despite being just an hour's drive from Milan, its location in the hills of Brianza made it a remote, quiet, and peaceful place. Residents had thrived here by growing and harvesting crops like leeks, celery, and especially chestnuts from the bountiful trees which grew on the mountain slope. Things were good, but everything changed when Count Mario Bagno, a local businessman, began building new infrastructure in the country during the economic boom. He saw Consonno as an untapped opportunity, and it was here he would build his city of toys, hoping to bring in tourism and cash for Milan. But in order to make his dream a reality, he would have to demolish all the buildings of the ancient village, and the nearby hill was leveled with explosives to provide a better view of the Alps. The only buildings that remained were the 13th century church, rectory, and cemetery. While the city of toys would be compared to Las Vegas, Count Bagno wanted to continue to build attractions like a soccer field, a basketball court, a tennis court, a golf course, a skating rink, an amusement park, and a zoo. Well, too bad though, the main road to Consonno was washed away after a few years of construction, eliminating the site's main flow of customers and effectively killing the project. Now, the odd half-completed village of kitschy buildings is abandoned and crumbling under decades of neglect and graffiti, and it's now just full of rides that will never be ridden. Number 18. Dinosaur World, Arkansas. Most of us grew up hoping that one day Jurassic Park would become a reality, but did you know there was already an amusement park that had long-extinct monsters on display known as Dinosaur World? It was opened in 1967 in Beaver, Arkansas, and when it opened, the 65-acre site was by far the largest dinosaur park on Earth. It featured more than 100 different life-size statues of dinosaurs and other prehistoric creatures, and also had a dedicated area to mythical beasts too, which during the 1970s had the world's largest King Kong statue that was more than 40 feet tall. The problem the dinosaur park faced, however, was that the only attractions it had were the statues and several smaller rides and simply couldn't compete with larger amusement parks. By the turn of the millennium, visitor numbers had begun to plummet, with the park seen as a prehistoric entertainment venue by modern standards, and it was forced to close for good in 2005. The statues were left in place, though, and in many ways it's now more interesting than it ever was when it was open. Most of them still stand in place, surrounded by unkempt vegetation, and it feels like you've entered a lost world. Number 17. Disney's River Country, Florida. There's no doubt that Disney has built the most famous and successful amusement park empire in the world, but despite the company's experience in this industry, even they don't get it right every time. Disney World in Florida is by far the biggest collection of parks on Earth. You probably know that it includes 2 water parks, but did you know that there was originally a third called Disney's River Country? It was actually the company's first water park and opened in June of 1976. It was built along the shore of Bay Lake and had a Wild West theme and featured 2 large swimming pools, 5 water slides, and 2 large areas dedicated to children's activities. It was the success of River Country that led to the development of Typhoon Lagoon and Blizzard Beach, but with far more planning and investment going into those 2, River Country was soon seen as the least exciting of them all. With falling visitor numbers and several deaths that happened on site, it closed at the end of the 2001 season and was never reopened. The structures of the park still remain to this day, however, albeit in a rundown state. The only thing Disney did was to drain one of the larger pools and erect fencing around the site to prevent anyone from gaining access. But in recent years, it's become a popular destination for urban explorers. It's creepy seeing a place that was designed for so many thousands of people being completely empty, with stagnant pools of water and crumbling slides all around. And while it may not have been demolished yet, there are rumors that the company eventually plans on completely redeveloping the site, perhaps as an extension to another park or as a brand new hotel complex. Number 16. Fantasy World. Sitting on the very top of a hill in the Philippines is a Disney-esque castle, but this massive and vibrant structure, which looks great, also seems a little out of place, and that's because it is. There were grand plans for the castle and its surrounding theme park to become the Disneyland of the Philippines, Fantasy World, and rival the international Disney theme parks. But seeing as how Fantasy World made it to this list, things didn't pan out so well. And while they clearly went ahead with construction, the dream of opening the park never came to be when the businessmen behind the project ran into some serious financial issues before construction was complete, forcing them to abandon this plan. The once vibrant colors of the castle are now quickly fading and chipping away. Paint peels from the walls of the unfinished rooms too. The rides lay rusted and dormant and now stand as a reminder of what could have been. Though the park didn't open as planned, folks can still enter and explore this nightmarish Disneyland and take photos. You can walk along the rope bridge that leads to the park's treehouse, which offers beautiful views of the local scenery. You can even climb the castle's towers and feel like a real-life Rapunzel surveying the empty kingdom. Number 15. Boomers Dania Beach. There are still 7 Boomers amusement parks in operation throughout California and Florida, but this is just a fraction of the number the company operated in its heyday, with at least 11 having been closed in recent years. Perhaps the most famous was the Dania Beach Park, which was in Fort Lauderdale and was home to what was once the largest wooden roller coaster in the state, known as the Hurricane. It was 100 feet tall, 3,200 feet long, and was by far the most impressive structure on the site, but surprisingly wasn't actually owned by Boomers and was run by a third party. After opening the ride in 2000, they soon found out there was a reason why Florida doesn't have many wooden coasters, and that's because the humid climate significantly increases the maintenance requirements, and it became commercially unviable. The coaster itself was closed in 2011. The rest of the park with its mini-golf course and arcades followed suit in 2015, and for several years, the site was left to crumble. Urban explorers managed to capture incredible images of what the place looked like as it began to be overtaken by fast-growing trees and shrubs, and was only finally demolished a few years later to be replaced by a shopping mall. Number 14. Dunlin, Crinkly Bottom, England. It's not uncommon for an amusement park to be based upon an entertainment brand, but Crinkly Bottom in England was probably the most unusual example of this ever, taking inspiration from a popular Saturday night entertainment show at the time. Crinkly Bottom's mascot was Mr. Blobby, a giant spotty pink creature that became renowned in the country for his madcap antics. 3 parks were actually opened in the 1990s, with the biggest being located in Somerset. Dunlin, a recreation of Mr. Blobby's house, became one of the focal aspects of the park, but due to lack of interest, the funding was pulled less than a year after opening, and the park removed all references to the character. As for his home, it was sealed off and forgotten about until the 2000s when a group of urban explorers rediscovered it. It didn't matter that it had fallen into such a state of disrepair, and as such a nostalgic link to the 90s, what remained of Dunlin became a site for illegal raves and parties, and the polystyrene toilet was even removed and placed on display in an art gallery. For fear of injuries and lack of control over what was happening there, the landowner was eventually forced to demolish the entire site, and sadly, Dunlin was removed for good. Number 13. Yongma Land, South Korea. Built in the 1980s, Yongma Land was a small family-focused amusement park near Seoul in South Korea. It was full of pop culture icons from the time and underwent very little development. By the time it finally closed its doors in 2011, which meant it remained a memory of times gone by, attendance had drastically fallen thanks to the opening of modern theme parks nearby and stories of hauntings. But rather than demolishing the site or preventing anyone from accessing it, it's now gained a new lease of life by welcoming visitors who want to see the park in its ongoing state of decay. with an octopus ride covered in rust, stacks of broken Dodgem cars, a broken-down clown roller coaster, and a collapsing Viking ship. The new owner charges around $5 for entry, and for $30, will even turn on the lights of the haunted merry-go-round in the evening. Those familiar with K-pop music videos may recognize the faded colors and broken machinery from some recent hits, as it's also often hired out for creepy location shoots for various productions. It's the only former amusement park in the world that's still open to guests and has now become a spooky attraction in its own right. Number 12. Ho Thuy Tien, Vietnam. With an incredible 3-story tall dragon aquarium at the center of the park, Ho Thuy Tien was said to be the next big thing when it opened in Vietnam in 2004. The water park was built around a lake with a focal feature in the middle, and as you walked up the central staircase, you'd find yourself surrounded by tanks that contained a wide variety of animals, including rays, sharks, and even crocodiles. The problem, though, was that with costs escalating, the investors in the $3 million park insisted that it opened before it was fully complete, and this led to an underwhelming response by visitors. Within a few years, it was no longer sustainable and it was closed, and with no funds left to demolish any of the structures, they were left in place. Even the animals in the aquarium were simply released into the lake, which led to a large crocodile population establishing itself in the following years. Ho Thuy Tien, which was once easy to get to, was removed from all the guidebooks, and access was restricted, meaning only those who knew exactly where it was were able to return. There was something about the dragon building, which had begun to crumble, that seemed majestic amongst its surroundings. It became such a popular destination that there were even reports of a refreshment truck offering drinks to visitors inside the perimeter of the abandoned venue. As for the crocodiles, they remained an ever-present threat to the people who took the risk of visiting, and authorities were eventually forced to relocate them to a nearby wildlife park, although this hardly means the polluted water is now safe to swim in. Number 11. Wonderland, Eurasia. Once it was touted as the biggest theme park in Europe, Wonderland Eurasia opened in Ankara, Turkey, in March of 2019 to much fanfare. The 320-acre theme park featured 17 roller coasters and dozens of other attractions, so it's safe to say that this place was going to be pretty epic, even if it cost the Ankara Metropolitan Municipality hundreds of millions of dollars to build. But despite all that fanfare, it closed its doors permanently in 2020, not even making it to its one-year anniversary. So what happened to Wonderland Eurasia? Well, the place was set up to fail because just 48 hours after opening, one of the rides suffered a malfunction, forcing people to evacuate, and further political turmoil, subpar ride quality, and the lack of attendance all contributed to the park's downfall. The operator struggled to pay both the staff and the utility bills, and so it closed before they could even finish building some of the attractions. Today, the site looks more like a dump than an actual amusement park, as decaying dinosaurs, broken-down models, and headless robotic features dominate the landscape, creating a particularly eerie scene just outside of the capital city. Number 10. Dadipark, Belgium. Dadipark in Muslin, Belgium, was first opened in the 1950s as a small playground to entertain the children of pilgrims who were visiting the local church, but became so popular that in the 1970s, it underwent a program of redevelopment to install a series of new attractions such as a huge monkey bridge course and several water rides. This brought new visitors from far and wide, and at its peak, saw more than 1 million guests passing through the turnstiles each year. As tastes began to change, however, the park's popularity declined, and the final straw came as a result of years of underinvestment. The rides became more and more dangerous, and in 2000, a young boy lost his arm as a result of an accident on the Nordic jet ride. The park never recovered, and within 2 years it was permanently closed. The larger rides were taken down over the next few years, but most of the other structures were left in place, now overgrown. You can hardly tell that it used to be such a busy park. The only clues of what used to be there are the occasional metal railings and derelict buildings. It's become famous within the urban explorer community for the relative ease of access and the unusual objects that remain, many of which have religious influences. But because the authorities became concerned by an increasing number of people who were trespassing on the site, they've continued to demolish more of the buildings. Plans are now underway to convert it into a hiking trail. Number 9. Ghost Town in the Sky, North Carolina. First opened in May of 1961, the Ghost Town in the Sky was a Wild West theme amusement park in Maggie Valley, North Carolina, built at an elevation of around 4,600 feet at the top of Buck Mountain. It was often called North Carolina's mile-high theme park. Built at a cost of $1 million, the owners enlisted the help of locals to faithfully recreate 40 replica buildings for the western town, and over the years, went on to build several rides, which included, as of 1986, a full-size roller coaster called the Red Devil. Right from the start, the park experienced issues, however. Despite attracting at its peak more than 600,000 visitors each year, there was no actual public road to access it. Instead, every guest had to arrive at a car park at the base of the mountain and use either a funicular railway or a 3,300-foot-long chairlift to reach it. In 2002, the chairlift failed and left people stuck for more than 2 hours, and this ultimately led to the park's closure. Very little has been spent for maintenance on any of the machinery, and the owners realized how dangerous it had all become. Despite an attempt to reopen in 2007 after extensive renovations, the ghost town in the sky closed its doors for good in 2009 and has been left to fall into an even worse state of disrepair ever since. There are still hopes that the investment will be found to try to reopen it again, which means that for the time being, it's been left to rust away and has become a thing of legend in urban explorer circles because of the difficulty of accessing the site. It's now just like an abandoned and haunted Wild West village, and the moment you set foot there, it feels like you've been transported back in time. Number 8. Okpo Land. There was a brief moment in time when South Korea's Okpo Land was one of the most famous amusement parks in all of Asia because of its proximity to the Daewoo Shipbuilding and Marine Engineering Shipyard. Okpo Land attracted a more affluent crowd. It was hugely popular among the local population when it opened and the ideal entertainment for those with the cash to spend. Things were good, but things went south quickly when the duck-themed ride, which was one of the main attractions in the park, caused at least one fatality in the early 1990s. And if that wasn't enough, a train derailed and fell to the ground, killing one and injuring several others. The ride would continue to operate, and no compensation or apology was ever received, giving rise to rumors about the owner paying off local officials, which would obviously leave a sour taste in the mouths of patrons. In 1999, someone would die on that ride again when one of the trains derailed and capsized, killing a young girl. Following that accident, the park's owner vanished overnight, and Okpo Land was closed immediately and indefinitely. It remains abandoned, with the rides left in place, and the capsized duck train from which the child fell all those years ago remained hanging over the edge as it had done on that tragic day until the park was demolished in 2011. Number 7. Pripyat Amusement Park. When amusement parks open for the first time, it's often cause for huge excitement and celebration to the local community who are able to take advantage of the new facilities for the first time. In the case of the newly built Pripyat Amusement Park, however, this anticipation soon evaporated because just days before the official opening, something terrible happened. It was April of 1986, and with the final touches of paint still drying, the park was ready for the grand opening at the beginning of May. Early in the morning on the 26th of April, one of the worst nuclear accidents to ever take place happened at the nearby Chernobyl power plant. This meant that not only was the opening cancelled, the entire city of Pripyat was evacuated and had never been repopulated since because of radiation levels. At the center of the amusement park was an 85-foot-tall Ferris wheel that's become an iconic image of the effects of the disaster on the local community, and it still stands in its place to this day. The other rides are still there too. Apart from during tests, they were never open to the general public. The open space was used by helicopters in the aftermath of the accident, which meant that higher levels of radiation were deposited there than elsewhere, and tests have shown that the concrete areas are still highly dangerous. Still, if you're feeling brave enough, it's possible to take tours through the ghost city of Pripyat, and the amusement park is one of the most impactful stops along the route. Number 6. Spreepark, Berlin. Berlin's Spreepark was one of the most visited attractions in the city, with more than 1.5 million visitors each year, but poor financial management meant that it would eventually be forced to close and has since become an abandoned wilderness. It was first opened in 1969 to much excitement, especially because of the towering Ferris wheel. Following the reunification of Germany in 1989, huge investment was used to put it on par with Western-style parks, roller coasters, water rides, several themed village areas. It was during the 90s that it reached its heyday. The lack of transport to the park, though, meant that they were never able to attract enough people to recoup the huge investment, and with spiraling debt, Spreepark was closed in 2002. Some of the rides were shipped to Peru to try to open a new park, while the buildings that remained were left to fall apart. While there are plans to try to renovate the site and reopen it, for now, it remains a memory of what once was, and it's occasionally open for performances, festivals, and screenings of movies that benefit from the creepy surroundings. Number 5. Six Flags New Orleans. Originally opening as Jazzland in the year 2000, Six Flags took control of the amusement park on the outskirts of New Orleans in 2003. They had high hopes for what they could do with the venue, but unfortunately, it was flooded during Hurricane Katrina, which was responsible for so much pain and suffering in the city. As for the theme park, it took a month before the floodwaters receded, and by that time, the site had been ruined. Faced with a bill of tens of millions of dollars to fix things, since more than 80% of the buildings and virtually all of the rides had been destroyed, Six Flags instead removed all salvageable assets and reinstalled them in other parks. Now covered in graffiti in every direction, infested with rodents and overgrown, it's now become a popular destination for urban explorers, and it's been used as a location in a number of movies, including Jurassic World and Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. Number 4. Joyland, Kansas. Opened in 1949 and only closing 55 years later in 2004, Joyland was once the premier amusement park in Kansas. It had 25 rides, including an amazing wooden roller coaster called Nightmare, along with a number of other classic designs from the 40s and 50s. Problems began in 2004 with the aging infrastructure, which began when a young girl fell from the more than half-a-century-old Ferris wheel. The ensuing investigations found that many of the other structures were unsafe too, and it would have cost so much to fix these problems that the decision was made to close the park for good. Since that day, the park has remained in place, and apart from a couple of fires that have destroyed buildings and the inevitable vegetation that's begun to grow over everything, it's still recognizable as Joyland, although in a frighteningly run-down state. This might not be the end of the story, though, because the site was sold in 2018 for just under $200,000, and it's quite possible that the new owners will complete the plans for renovations to find a way to open it once more. Number 3. Camelot, UK. Whether or not you believe in the legend of King Arthur, there's one thing for sure: Camelot most certainly did exist, albeit as a small theme park in England that was opened between 1983 and 2012. Based around the legends, visitors entered the huge castle when they first arrived and had a choice of a wide range of rides, just like you'd expect from the best parks. 2012 proved to be a tough year, though, and with a continued trend of reducing visitor numbers, the park was forced to close. Some of the rides were sold to other parks, but the rest were left standing, and in some cases were still visible from the nearby motorway. It's now one of the creepiest abandoned parks you'll ever see, mainly thanks to the fantasy-style theme it had and how this now looks after the buildings have begun to decay. Plants have begun to grow all over the structures. Walking through, you'd almost believe you had been transported to a long-forgotten time in history, and you can never quite be sure what you'll find around each corner. Number 2. Gulliver's Kingdom. Gulliver's Travels may be a classic book, but adapting that old tale into a theme park proved to be a pretty rough idea. Gulliver's Kingdom theme park was built near Japan's Mount Fuji using some newfound government stimulus money. This massive white elephant existed for only 10 years, and today, there's little if any trace of the abandoned theme park. All that's left are the ruins of the giant Gulliver himself. The park opened to the public in 1997 and was created with the hope of bringing the economy out of the post-economic bubble downturn. But this park was doomed from the get-go. It was backed financially by the Nagata Chua Bank, which later collapsed after some very, very bad loans before becoming what's known as a zombie bank. The negative bank was forced to clear the books of all unprofitable assets, one of which was Gulliver's Kingdom, which ran them about $350 million. In October of 2001, the unpopular theme park shut its doors for the last time. But on top of the bad bank loans, Gulliver's Kingdom had some pretty morbid neighbors: Aokigahara, more commonly and sadly known as the Suicide Forest, and the Kamikwashiki Village, which was home to a notorious doomsday cult. So even if the park did survive those loans, it likely would have not seen much traffic, seeing as how those two surrounding areas are not something locals like to be reminded of. Number 1. Wonderland, China. It's no surprise that after seeing how successful an amusement park can be, various companies decide to try to cash in by building one of their own. Of course, it's not quite as easy as it may seem, and the investors behind Wonderland in Beijing, China, definitely bit off more than they could chew. The idea was that it would become the largest amusement park in Asia across a more than 120-acre site, and they do this by directly copying what had been proven to work elsewhere. Problems began in the construction phase, though, and in 1998, work was halted because of financial irregularities. Attempts to start construction again in 2008 failed too in the wake of further financial difficulties, and all dreams of finishing the project were dashed. It remained, however, with the shell of a castle and a number of other incomplete structures that became an attraction in their own right for people wanting to imagine what could have been. Local farmers who had been forced to sell their land for the park began to take it back and grow their crops there, and soon very little remained. It was bizarre to see a magical world in the middle of nowhere with no actual magic, and eventually, authorities wanted to be rid of the failed project. The remaining structures were demolished in 2013, and now a shopping mall stands in place of where the castle once was. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.